Welcome to MRE Uncut, where we'll give you real and practical insights into the real estate scene in Melbourne. We'll discuss what's happening in the industry, all backed by MRE's history of over 30 years in the game. With that said, let's jump into this week's episode of MRE Uncut.
Welcome back to another episode of MRE Uncut. My name is Stephen Fitzsimon. Welcome aboard. And today I have with me Laura Moody, who is our Head of Operations in our Property Services Department. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me back.
No problem, you're always welcome. And today our guest is Craig Topp. Craig is the expert in all things compliance from Property Compliance Victoria. He has joined us today to talk through the ongoing and recent upgrading of the legislation in relation to property compliance in residential properties in Victoria. Craig, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
So, Craig, can you give us a quick insight into your role at Property Compliance Victoria and the work that you do?
Right, Property Compliance Victoria, we've been around since the minimum standards legislation was put in place. We complete minimum standards audits and reporting and then supporting of the property management cohort. My role in the organisation is to manage the customer engagement and customer relationship management processes associated with that, with our agencies and property management cohorts.
So you're dealing with the people that are at the front line of dealing with these issues in relation to compliance?
Absolutely. Property managers are the people that we deal with day to day, every day.
Yeah, fascinating. Let's wind it back a little bit. For the ill-informed, in 2021, the government introduced 14 minimum standards for renting properties. So now if you've got a property and you want to rent it out, it's got to comply with these 14 minimum standards. Can you give us an overview of the ones that you see are sort of the most talked about amongst the property managers of Melbourne?
Yeah. Whenever we talk minimum standards with property managers, and we do that constantly, the big one that keeps coming up is mould.
Right.
You know, what is mould and what is a pass and what is a fail in relation to mould within a residential rental environment? What's, as per the legislation, mould caused by the structure?
Yes.
Or a fault in the structure of the dwelling?
Yes.
And what is caused by tenants' living habits?
Yes, and they're not cleaning.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. So that's probably the biggest talking point.
Okay.
We have a blitz each year with CAV, just calling them and talking about and asking for clarification around the standards, because the legislation, as I think you know, Steve, is pretty ambiguous in the way that it's written.
How's that going?
Well, the legislation's not changing, but the interpretations of the legislation continue to change. On our most recent blitz, we do this every year because we like to get a clear run into the year as, okay, here is the direction from CAV, if you like, the police force of minimum standards.
Yeah, Consumer Affairs Victoria.
Correct, sorry. And, you know, silly things keep happening. But when we were talking about mould recently and asking, you know, how do we apply the legislation as it applies to mould for residential tenancies, given the fact that there is this disparity, you know, what's structure, what's living habits. So what we ended up coming up with after all of that discussion was that surface mould will no longer be found as a fail under minimum standards unless it's accompanied with a high moisture reading where that mould exists.
Okay, so you've got to now there's a bit of mould on a wall. If you clean it off and you do a moisture test on it, it's fine.
Even if you don't clean it off. So there's moisture there on the top. Use your moisture meter. The moisture meters and any good moisture meter will only judge what's behind that fixture. So you could actually have a wet surface, put your moisture reading on there. But if the structure behind that was dry,
then you're fine.
Great. Now that was a huge change.
Yeah.
And
when did they do that and where did they advertise that?
They don't advertise it.
So why wouldn't they advertise that if everyone's got to comply with it?
That's a great question. That's why we continually ring, right? So when we have these campaigns, we will call CAV so many times and we get, and anybody that's dealt with CAV, and we understand why, but you'll get different answers. You know, another example of that is locks. So external door locks, the legislation clearly says you have to be able to lock and unlock with a key from the outside and lock and unlock with or without a key from the inside.
Yeah.
Happened to trip across the CAV website a few weeks back, and on the CAV website it says from the inside you should be able to unlock without a key. Now, we agree with that proposition and have been arguing that for a long time, because in a situation where a fire breaks out at night, if you've got a lock that can only be locked with a key from the inside or unlocked with a key from the inside, the kids have knocked off the key and right?
Yeah.
You're in a real danger of a fire hazard. So we actually agree with the interpretation that CAV now have on their website. But when we make our calls and we ask CAV representatives, what do we go with? Do we go with the legislation, or do we go with what's on your website?
You have to go with the legislation, don't you?
Well, of course we do. But even CAV are saying, 60% of the time we spoke to them, they're saying, no, go with the legislation. And 40% of the time they're saying, no, you've got to go with what's on the website. So
locks and mould, and basically we've got no idea what's going on.
It's probably the biggest challenge, I think, for PMs and for us as an audit business, where we take on the liability where we're engaged to conduct an audit and make a determination on pass or fail. So it's a big issue for us too. It's why we place so much time and effort.
So I'm seeing, CAV sending out these letters and doing these spot checks and all of this sort of stuff. This is happening now. We've experienced it in our business. So there's no doubt that they're out there and they're doing the checks. They're talking about $11,000 fines. I asked them a question, using the channels.
Yes.
Who pays the $11,000?
It's the owner.
Well, they haven't answered me. I've asked them again. So I'm going to see where they go with it. I would assume it's the owner. Mm-hmm. But agents are supposed to take reasonable steps to ensure that a property meets minimum standards, and we don't know what they are either.
Well, this is the problem, and it's all about to change and even get a bigger issue for agencies, because the recent changes on March 6 suggests that unless you can prove as an agency that you've taken reasonable steps to make sure that the property is compliant, all of a sudden you're liable for a $59,000 fine.
Bingo.
Right? So
what are reasonable steps? And they create legislation, they don't tell us what the reasonable steps are.
Should property managers be checking this at their inspections? Are they meant to be going with a moisturator on the walls if they see mould?
When we spoke to CAV about this a couple of years ago now, it was interesting because our question to them was, how does a property manager protect themselves from a situation where their owner, their rental provider is slapped with an $11,500 fine? The first thing they're going to do is turn to the property manager and say, well, this is your issue. You're my property manager.
Yeah, what am I paying you
Property
for?
manager says, well, no, how do they protect themselves? So we got into a big conversation around how do agencies protect themselves from that situation. And it was all very clear that ongoing communication and processes and other stuff that I know that MRE are all over is the way forward. But inevitably there's going to be a situation where you have a civil litigation dispute.
You're having an argument.
That's right.
And the argument's caused by a lack of clarity.
But the interesting part of that conversation we said at that time when we said, well, how do agencies protect themselves from that? And they reinforce it is ongoing communication and education with the rental providers around what are the minimum standards and what are your obligations.
Isn't that CAV's role?
I think it's partly CAV's role, but it's also partly the property manager's role.
I'm talking more about if you're a private landlord not using an agent, it's CAV's role.
Absolutely.
But if you're a private landlord using an agent, therefore it's the agent's role. Like I sit there and I challenge that because the reality is both of them are private landlords. Both of them are renting out their properties. Both of them need to know the legislation around their own actions and their requirements. And then one of the times they're looking at an agent. Yeah, sure, the agent should be speaking to the owners and doing the right things. But I don't think that you can create legislation that has gaps as broad and as wide as the ones that we're seeing right now.
It's there.
Yeah, I know it's there.
Absolutely there.
But I don't think enough people know the problems that agencies and private landlords, like, you know, the people say, I like that one. They could borrow that from Trump, right? So some people say that about 33% of the properties that are out there, the rental properties that are out there, are privately managed, right? So even if it's 20%, it's still over 100,000 in Victoria are privately managed. They've got very little idea on, one, what the minimum standards are, because it hasn't really been advertised. Mm-hmm. We speak to new clients joining us all the time. They've got no idea about the minimum standards mm-hmm. that are out there. Then they're going to try and harp down on it more, but the legislation is botched. I
totally agree, and I think the private landlord conversation is going to become a much bigger part of the conversation. So a couple of years ago, when organisations like MRE and most of the larger franchises became very focused on minimum standards compliance and started to put a lot of training and other processes in place, there were some owners that said, I'm not going to buy into this, I'm out of here. Yeah, and they'd walk out and they'd go to the smaller independent.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, I would say over the last 18 months that has changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. And I've personally been in meetings with smaller independent agencies, and when I say small, they're still managing 300, 500 properties where they'd done nothing with smoke alarm, electricity and gas for 5.5 years and didn't even know what minimum standards were. Yeah. Now, they're all saying, come on in, help us get cleaned up. We just can't afford the liabilities that are headed our way. Yeah. So the next natural step for those recalcitrant landlords that want to avoid doing the right thing is to become a private landlord. Yeah. I would suggest they're doing that at their own peril, because the people that are in CAV at the moment are all over this. They have access to the trust bond data. They have access to realestate.com and domain.com, and they have their data analysts looking at and tracking what's happening to rental properties, because I'm sure that with the changes in fines that are coming into place later on this year, that they're looking forward to having an opportunity to grabbing a couple of private landlords and imposing significant fines on there and hanging them out to the industry as an example as to why you shouldn't be doing that. So private landlords that try to take it on, yes, they have the challenge of, actually understanding what the legislation is and what it means and then being able to manage it. Yeah. But if they're trying to avoid that, they're really rolling the dice in a big way.
Fascinating. So let's cover a little bit more on these minimum standards. So you've talked already about mould, and you've talked about the locks. Mm-hmm. You've talked about how there's been some recent changes to the legislation strengthening those requirements, one of which is now in the future you will not be able to advertise a property until it meets minimum standards. Currently, you can advertise the property, but it needs to meet minimum standards before the tenant moves in. And I understand the whys around the changes. So they quoted that for that instance, they wanted tenants not to be then moving in, the works not to have been completed, and then they're suffering living in a property doesn't meet minimum standards for a period, and it creates more problems. So change the rule. But there are other ones that have created questions from our team and in the marketplace. Ones such as the requirement for a 2-star energy efficient heater and to be in the lounge. So, people don't understand, and a lot of agents that are out there still, because I see it on Real Estate Common Domain, you see these properties that are advertised and they've got an electric panel heater on the wall in the lounge room, and that is it. Mm-hmm. And you sit there and you go, there isn't an electric panel heater that is a 2-star energy efficient rating, so therefore that doesn't meet the minimum standards. But people don't know this.
That's right.
Right? And agents don't know this.
Yeah, that's right.
And so we're sitting there and we're like, okay, that's not clear, right? That hasn't been advertised clearly by CAV as to what that means, because the market is not aware. And they can do the research themselves. I'm sure they're sitting there on realestate.com and hopefully identifying those ones as part of their checks. But it's a significant concern. Then it goes on in relation to that one. They talk about you need to have a 2-star energy efficient heater unless it is something that can't be done correct me if I'm wrong here,
Cost prohibitive.
Cost prohibitive.
Laws of
the owners' corporation or heritage.
Correct.
And so I asked Consumer Affairs, yet to receive a reply, what is cost prohibitive? Just so I, as a agent, can go into a property and say, look, the cost to install this in this property is $3,000. Is that cost prohibitive?
We ask the same question, right? And the answer is always the same. Go to VCAT.
So go to VCAT.
Yeah,
so they're going to fine us.
CAV will not give you any clarification on or interpret the legislation.
Yes.
But then how are they going to make the decision when the task force goes into the property and says it doesn't make compliance, and how can we prove that?
This is a really good point. We had a situation just before Christmas where we were doing a massive audit program for one of our clients out in the West. We'd happened to audit 4 properties that CAV came into the week after. We failed those 4 properties for various reasons. CAV passed them. Now, that was a huge red flag for me. So I jumped on all the channels available to me in relation to CAV saying, listen, I think we've got a problem here. And we had some ideas about how we might be able to sit together and do some calibration of, what is.
Passes and fails.
We would be happy to share with the entire industry to try and bring about some clarity to this. Crickets. Yeah.
Which that blows my mind, because is everyone panicking too much? Maybe the minimum standards, what we think isn't compliant, is actually compliant. Are we fear-mongering? We need to be able to tell these clients that, because private owners who aren't trying to dodge the system, they're genuinely, where do they get this information from?
Absolutely. And the mole case earlier, now we've got a pretty definitive protocol for how we assess whether something is a fail on mould based on structural issues or whether it's tenant living habits. But we need that for many, many of the standards.
Yeah, much so. And it needs to be advertised.
That's right.
But I sit there and I ask myself the question. I honestly, this is just coming into my head now based on this discussion, right? So let's imagine, right? So I could get this completely confused and wrong, so forgive me if I do that. It wouldn't be the first time on this podcast. If I advertise a property now, I'm allowed to advertise without it meeting the minimum standards now, right? Mm-hmm. So I advertise a property now. I lease the property, but Consumer Affairs have done a check in between it and gone, oh, hang on, it doesn't meet minimum standards for this reason, okay? Then the tenant goes, it doesn't meet minimum standards, I'm out of here, because they can move in, right? Go, we've got this report from CAV saying it doesn't meet minimum standards. I'm saying it doesn't meet minimum standards. Perhaps even the tenant called in CAV and they said it didn't meet minimum standards. Then you go to VCAT, right? And you go to VCAT and you say, and you win at VCAT. Who then pays for the tenant that's already vacated, found some other property and done all of that when you've won? Does VCAT, can we get it?
The tenant.
Well, it's not going to be the tenant, but is it going to be
who?
The government?
Like, it's not going to be the government either.
Like, who does? Because if this is the can of worms that could be opened by a declaration or a statement or a consideration. Like, it only takes an inspector to walk in and go, no, I don't believe that meets minimum standards. For the tenant to go, I've got a report saying that they don't believe it to meet minimum standards, therefore I'm out.
Yeah. Look, in CAV's defence, I'd say the behaviour that we're seeing out there is when they do find fault, and if it's, a singular or maybe a couple of faults, it's a lock or you need some new blinds, they're really working very proactively with the property managers to resolve that issue and bring it up to speed.
I agree, right? I agree. The challenge is that we're at that stage now where they're trying to work proactively to bring things up to state. If they go down the pathway of going, I'm going to issue a fine, at that time, I'm just, I don't know where it's going to go.
This is where my cynical hat comes on, Later on this year, $59,000 fine.
Yeah.
to an agency.
Yeah.
No clarity around what is reasonable care.
Yep.
Right? No clarity on what is pass and fail.
Yes.
For a lot of the standards.
Yes.
How are they ever going to enforce that?
Yeah.
We're either going to have VCAT clogged up for the next 10 years.
No one's going to want a 60
or
grand
there's
fine.
going to be the royal decree.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm sure that agencies aren't going to just roll over and hand over $59,000.
No, I can tell you when they're not.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, you know, it becomes a matter of it'd be nice to have an opportunity to work more closely with Consumer Affairs Victoria and their audit team to try and dispel some of the...
Yeah, they've got to answer their emails. The challenge that I have is that I also feel for Consumer Affairs Victoria because they've been like tasked with their task force. They've been tasked to look at these requirements and create change and implement them, but the legislation's faulty.
Not very supportive of it, is it?
It is in no way, shape or form. So the question here is, who created the legislation? Like, where does the buck stop? Does it stop with Jacinda Allen and the Labor government, or does she say, well, that was Dan? So it's not really on my watch, but these ones are. Because I don't understand and I don't get clarity and I don't get responses. And I sit there and I go, well, where do we go next? Jackie Felgate, or is this like a current affair where we've got to get to, or like how do we get to the next step of actually making people aware of this? Because I look at this from a tenant viewpoint. I look at this from a private landlord. I look at it from an agent, and I look at it from a client of an agent. Mm-hmm. And I cannot see clarity, and I cannot see a vision of where this functions in the way that they want it to, where they say to people, you need to do all of this, this, and this, and have the stick. Because I don't think at the moment they've got the stick available. That's the way I look at it. There's a threat of a stick, but I don't think the stick will work. I don't think the stick will stick.
maybe not.
No.
The legislation, I think we'd all agree, is really well intentioned.
Yes.
Tenants have a right to safe, habitable places to rent.
Yes.
No one
argues. No one's disputing that part of it
other than the blinds.
Other than the privacy.
The blinds I have no idea about.
Why?
Okay, so...
Well, it's a common one, but I'd be interested in why.
Okay, so picture this. You've got a beautiful house with 3-metre hedges around the backyard of the house, completely private.
Mm-hmm.
You've got double height ceilings in the living area and sheer curtains that run across the living area. Okay, the people who live in this beautiful house don't need the living area to be dark during the night. They don't want it. They've got 5 bedrooms, right? They need to have blockout blinds in their living area because it's got to provide reasonable darkness to the living area. It's got privacy.
And
the hedges are there, right? The hedges are there. It's got privacy. The same thing applies for a property that is in the country. It's got complete privacy, right? It's on an acreage. There's nobody that can look in. They need to have blockout blinds installed to provide darkness and privacy. And there is no exception to it, but there is no clarity to it. Reasonable darkness, what is that?
No, I agree. But, I think they're always catering for the worst case scenario. So rumour has it, Stephen, that you like to cook in the nude, right?
Yes.
Now, if you were renting,
it's not rumour.
No, if you were renting, right, and that was your lifestyle choice,
yes,
and someone could, through the hedges,
yes,
from the next paddock,
good luck to them,
right? look into the kitchen.
That's what floats their boat.
Then, from a personal privacy standpoint, you need to be provided with the opportunity to have that privacy, which means block out blinds.
Yes.
So that's the other end of the argument. And I agree with you from a common sense thing, and I put common sense in inverted commas because they're the 2 words that we have coming back at us from CAV consistently.
Yeah.
But what is common sense to me and what is common sense to them?
But it gets worse than that because, like, technically speaking, if you apply the common sense, so let's apply the common sense protocol. You've got a beautiful property like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
you've never really cared about it's not a concern of yours,
Yes.
right? But you, just on the eve of you taking tenancy at that property, you have a disagreement with your partner, right? And you no longer require the property. So you collect the keys, you go there on the first day, you go, it doesn't have block-out roller blinds here, I'm out of here.
Yep,
right?
that's right.
And you can walk away from the tenancy.
That's right.
So it's got implications that go beyond common sense,
Yes.
that create a risk to the agent, because the owner would be furious if the agent hadn't made them aware and all of this sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
But the owners don't want to spend, and this is where it gets down to the implications of enforcing this as an agent. So if I say to a client, look, come on board, we'll lease your property out, but mind you, you're going to have to spend $5,000 putting in double height blinds in this beautiful lounge room that they're never going to get used. And the next agent goes, no, don't worry about it, right? They save the $5,000, they go to the next agent. If they don't encounter the problem, then we've lost the business as a result of trying to demonstrate the correct use of the thing.
Interpreting correctly.
Correct.
That's right.
And on the flip side of that, the tenants may well walk in and walk out of the tenancy.
That's right.
So, like for me, we've got legislation that needs to be improved, but we don't hear from the government or CAV in terms of clarity around how it is improved and where the work is and where it's up to date. Yet when we speak to bodies like the REIV and we speak to you today, and I thank you for coming in, we're still looking at at trying to understand this mess that we're in now, and we're screaming towards, it's been 3 and a bit years since they were originally implemented. They've now been strengthened. And on the 25th of November, they become a lot tighter than they have been.
Yes.
Yet we still don't know what the hell's going on.
Yep. It's a big part of the reason why we've just done a deep dive into the data associated with the last 15,000 audits that we've conducted. And we partnered with La Trobe University and their data analyst groups and gave them that data, because all of our audits are done via an app, so easily data captured, gave them that data and said, have a look at that and tell us what we don't know. And give us some insights that allow us to use that data as a point of leverage with the government and CAV and other interested parties to see if we can't bring the groups together. And the data that's coming out, the analysis that's coming out of that is just mind-boggling. It's stuff that you would never imagine. We've only just gotten the last cut of the report. Now, it is our hope that we're going to be able to use that with the minister, with the head of CAV and other interested parties in some sort of roundtable type forum to look at that data and to have or to at least begin a conversation that might lead us towards a point where we do have some clarity and consistency in our understanding of what the legislation means and how it's being interpreted and what's going to be enforced.
I think it's really important that we get that soon, because we have our election coming up. Still got to vote this week. That's coming up, and the whole thing is about housing. Are we going to have enough housing for everyone? Well, there's going to be a lot of people pulling their property from the market, not because their property is not compliant, but because they're scared of the implications if they're wrong.
The fear-mongering on the fines is doesn't, like, where else do you don't buy shares and go, oh, I'm going to get a $11,000 fine because I bought BHP. Like, it's just putting it in a new level. I want to cover off on a couple more things. Do you think these rules, or do you perceive that these rules are going to get tighter again?
I think there's going to be ongoing changes. I mean, it's become a political issue, and as soon as politics is involved, it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
So there's been talk about air conditioning.
Yes.
We expect that to come in.
So air conditioning being a minimum requirement for
minimum
rental
standard. Yeah. It didn't come in with the last round, but we fully expect that to be coming in. We think that minimum standards is going to become a mandated process. How that will work, because do you audit a place that's less than 5 years old of age at the same rate that you audit a 45-year-old property?
It's like your gas smoke.
That's right. So I think that it's inevitable that the legislation will continue to change.
Yeah.
How tight, or I'm sure it's not going to get looser.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sure it's not going to get looser. So I would imagine that with that change, there's going to be some more tightening.
So to finish, if there was one message that you had for Victorian homeowners in relation to the meeting these minimum standards and property, what is it?
Lean on your property manager for advice and guidance in relation to minimum standards. Take a bit of ownership yourself and educate yourself. There's a lot of resources out there in relation to what the obligations are for rental providers these days. And don't think that you're going to get away with it forever, because if your property doesn't meet the standards, we've got a much more educated cohort of tenants now. They have the ability to anonymously dob in a landlord, dob in an agent. Right? We've got a police force out there, the task force. It's not going away. So you need to educate yourself. If you've got a good property manager, they'll be equipped very well with resources and tools and be willing to spend the time to help you muddle through not only minimum standards compliance, but compliance generally within your rental property. That's my advice.
Perfect. Laura, Craig, thanks for coming in today.
My pleasure.
It's been another interesting session. We look forward to joining you on the next episode of MRE Uncut. Thanks for watching.